Hey everyone, I have Jacob here. Can I call you Jacob or Jake? What do you prefer?
Jacob's good.
Yeah, Jacob. And so this sort of stemmed from a conversation we had started in a group we're a part of about libertarianism, liberty, etc. And I kind of made some comments about Western culture and libertarianism, and more specifically, how if you want to make change in politics, it comes from culture, and then Western culture in general has devolved. And so, I think Jake kind of took the approach that Western civilization is a mess anyway, and it's never been great. So why don't you expand on that a little, Jake?
Sure, absolutely. So, I guess I'll start with a little bit of just of a caveat, which is not, to me, it's not a dichotomy of it's either all good or all bad.
Sure.
I'm not gonna, I would never want to defend the position that Western culture has no good aspects to it, because
Right.
that's just not true. But in terms of, as both a Christian and a libertarian, I don't think that there is much to be gained by focusing on Western culture, because I do think it is a bit of a mixed bag. Although it does depend on how we define Western culture, because it is somewhat of a subjective word, a description of
Yeah. I can. Well.
so that's something we can get into. But I
Yeah.
guess my main point was um,
Sure.
was just basically that uh, because we got into two things. One, which was the relationship between politics and culture, but it's also the idea of Western culture, and if as
Yeah.
Christians and libertarians, we should look at this as something that's good and worth preserving. And to me, it's just like, well, the good stuff's worth preserving. The not so good stuff, I don't really care for. But to me, the good parts of Western culture, I think, you know, aren't unique to Western culture. So, that would be, I guess, kind of my opening
Yeah.
explanation of where I'm coming from.
Yeah. So can we, I guess, define Western culture a little more, maybe, so we can just be sure? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and I guess I've always viewed Western culture as, I mean, there's two things. One, we have to define, kind of the geographical boundaries of it. And Western culture, I think, throughout history has geographically expanded. It might have
Mhm.
started. It really kind of started in Europe, probably as a result of the Enlightenment period, and then kind of grew from that into the Americas, and
Right.
maybe today kind of exists a little bit into it's still predominantly Western Europe, but I think some
Yeah.
areas in kind of the central heading towards Eastern Europe might you might expand them to include those as Western culture. But beyond the geographical aspects of it, I guess uh, that's where it gets trickier to define it, which is
Right.
and that's kind of why I asked. Sometimes it's like I, I don't know what people mean by it, other than like, is it just the culture of the West, or are we just going to conflate Western culture with Enlightenment values? So I don't want to just answer your question with a question, but uh, the post you made, you brought up Western culture.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I don't have a strict definition I hold to. What was your use of it? I guess would be
Yeah. I would.
what I'd want
Yeah.
to focus on.
Yeah, I would say Western culture, in the way that I typically tried to define it, was a heritage of ethical values that stemmed out of Western Europe. So if you want to say that that's expanded outside now, to even South America, Central America, some places, South Africa, Australia, that's those aren't the West, but I think it's the ideas and ethics that came out of uh, Western Europe, somewhere around the Enlightenment, maybe slightly after. Um, and I think it's also fair to say that most people, and even myself, tend to identify the United States as Western culture in, equivalency. As far as popularity goes, pop culture, etc., the United States dominates a lot of that. So, for this purposes, I'd say it's values out of Western Europe from the Enlightenment and how they've brought in their ethics and individualism into most countries that adopt those.
Okay, and again, so that's a good definition to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the definition, I would say then, kind of like I said in my opening statement, yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, parts of the values coming out of Western Europe that are good. We talk about John Locke. We talk about the ideas of personal liberty, limited government, the idea that there should not be this idea of the absolute monarch. We talk about the ideas of kind of self government. That if there, whatever you want to call government, because I know libertarianism is sort of the audience we're talking to. There's going to be anywhere from kind of classical liberals to all the way down to anarchists. But just the idea that whatever you call government, that it should be limited, that it should be to, basically that the laws and the function of the government should be not to function as rulers, but to function as mechanisms for securing and protecting rights. And, I'm a libertarian, so you're not going to hear me wage against that stuff. But there's also a lot of stuff that came from Western Europe that's not so good. I mean, we could talk about the French Revolution. We could talk about Karl Marx. We could talk about, socialism and fascism. A lot of this stuff has, roots in Western Europe too. So it's like, if we're just going to cherry pick the stuff we like, well, then are we talking about Western culture anymore? So it's a bit of a semantics game. It's not so much that we're at cross purposes over what we value, but it's just like, well, if what we value is not all of Western culture, then do we need to be calling it that? Because that can kind of confuse the conversation, I think.
Yeah, sure. Do you, okay. So, I mean, we obviously agree that there's a lot of things that have come poorly out of Western culture, but, in the alternative, would you say we would have been better off without such a change, maybe, at least as far as your values or your understanding goes?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question. Are you saying
so
there were?
you want to throw the
Go
baby
ahead.
out with the bathwater? I'm saying you have to take the good with the bad in all things, but I still think that you would still say the cream has risen to the top in Western culture.
Has it? Has it?
Well, I
I
mean,
mean,
that's a good question. Would you say that Marxism that arose out of that, some of that ideas in French Revolution, but was that adopted by the West, or was that adopted by?
maybe not at first, but just looking at the here and now, there's certainly a mixture that it's hard to say which, at this point in time, at least from my eyes, it's hard to say what part of Western culture is going to come out on top, at least in the here and now. It's not like one side's going to win for all time necessarily, but maybe for the beginning of the Enlightenment's effect on Western culture and that commingling, the stuff that was coming out was predominantly good. But right now, it seems to be, at least in my eyes, kind of shifting in the other direction. And
Sure.
I guess it's like you said, we have to take the good with the bad. I guess like a concept I would say that one thing we need to avoid is something that's referred to as the genetic fallacy, which is the idea that just because something came out of a particular set of circumstances or out of a certain place, that we have to preserve or value those circumstances as kind of conflating them with the good things that came out of it. I don't have any problem with the good things that came out of the Enlightenment, kind of the things I kind of spelled out, the ideas of liberty. But uh, you know, I would rather focus on just preserving liberty. And uh, if we're going to talk about preserving Western culture, um, to me that adds an unnecessary complicating element to the equation, because again, it's a term that's not objectively defined and means different things to anyone, because there's it, I pointed out Karl Marx, socialism, and all that, but I also said fascism. And for some people, Western culture is, we can look at people like the alt right and who say that Western culture is, things like Europeans Europe is for Europeans, and white Western culture is really, for whites, and we need to preserving Western culture to them kind of starts to look more like this identity politics that's played on the right. And I'm not a fan of that. I'm not a fan of the identity politics on the left either. But yeah, so it's just, to me, like, I want to be as clear with what I'm saying when I'm presenting my ideas to the world. And if I'm conflating things in that are going to distract the issue that don't necessarily need to be added in, I guess that's kind of where I'm coming from, which is that, like, both, and let's bring a little bit of the Christian worldview in, because we're both Christians. I don't see any reference to Western culture in the Bible. So, from that standpoint too, it's like, I don't see any biblical reason to care about preserving Western culture. Christianity was a good and a bad element at certain times during the development of Western culture. So to me, it's just kind of like, I'm not super motivated I'm not out there rallying against Western culture, but I'm not really out there trying to preserve it either. To me, it's just kind of this amalgamation of different things in history and forces that have come to this point that we've inherited. And I don't really want to focus on preserving the whole thing. It's like, I want to point out the things that I find to be logically consistent, that comport with reality, from kind of the libertarian view, the things that I think are going to bring about the most free and prosperous society. And B, from a Christian point of view, I want to point out the things and preserve the things that I think are most comporting to the teachings of Christ, and living out, my call as a Christian. And, that's where my focus is on. So that's why I just don't feel compelled to hang on to, what Western, this idea of Western culture.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about that. It's interesting you mentioned, you don't, so from a Christian worldview, the Western movement couldn't have occurred without the Christian worldview, in my opinion. So the idea of the individual, rugged individualism, being, I guess, the most extreme, maybe, but that concept is what springboarded a lot of the Enlightenment. Now, there was a lot of, I guess, throwing out a lot of the metaphysical with that, but wouldn't you say that the idea of the individual, I guess, empowered the Enlightenment Christianity? And I think the people have lost that in translation.
I think individualism is more or less good. I'm not the type of libertarian who has a problem with collectivism in a broad sense, because I mean, it seems to me that we have to kind of live our lives sort of, I think, foundationally as individuals first, of course. But on top of that, I also find myself in various groups where I have to get along with people collectively. And I don't think the issue so much is collectivism. I think the issue is kind of more how you stack how you build the building, so to speak.
Yeah.
Individualism certainly needs to be at the foundation, But at the same time, I do think that radical individualism, there are versions of that which I think are uh, antithetical potentially to libertarianism and certainly antithetical to Christianity because uh, to me Christianity isn't really predominantly about individualism or collectivism. I think that there are parts of the Bible which really speak to both.
Hmm.
It'd be my view.
Yeah, well, I mean, I see what you're saying there, but the interesting thing that's always kind of bothered me, or not bothered me, but been on my mind. So there's the idea of the individual in the Bible. Obviously, the individual must be protected, and the individual is recognized by God and Christ. But the collective church, right? Of the big C church, of all of God's people that have chosen to believe in Christ, or have, depending on your bend, that He's chosen. That collective only happens through God's creating the collective. So when you're in society, the only way that a true collective could be created outside of God is through some other coercion.
Is
The
it?
only way
I
that a
mean,
collective actually occurs through Christianity is God has created the church, right, and created the unifying glue of this collective through His authority. But on earth, the collective is going to be through some other form of authoritarian or coercion, um, to have a true collective.
I apologize, but I disagree, and part of this might be I don't maybe we aren't saying the same thing when we're saying the word collective. I mean,
Yeah, sure.
to me, a collective is just a group of people who come together for a particular purpose, and I mean, kind of seems to
Yeah.
me that I mean, you and I met and started talking in a collective, the group on Facebook
Okay.
that got together for a particular purpose. Now, maybe I'm using the word too broadly in your view, and that's fine. Maybe we need to, maybe to you, the word collective needs to be talked about in a context that's more, uh, you know, more hashed out.
Well, I
And
would say, I mean, it's voluntary collectivism isn't really collectivism. It's individuals deciding that this is a good idea and going with it.
but it's still. I mean, but to me, this goes. That's kind of what I said at the beginning, which is obviously the foundation has to be individuals, and I agree that if if collectivism is obtained through coercive forces, through some kind of authority, top-down use of force to collectivize people, well,
Mm.
that's obviously tyranny, and that's antithetical to libertarianism. And I would even say, outside of, in the Christian worldview, we obviously think to one extent or the other, God has authority to do, some of these things. But outside of God, in the Christian worldview, we would say that no human outside of God granted authority has the right to do that. Um, but uh, I don't think that it's semantically correct to say that anytime we look at a voluntarily formed group of people, that it's sort of like the denying of compounds and the denying of elements and the denying of physical reality by saying, well, physical reality doesn't exist. All it is just a bunch of atoms interacting with one another. It's like, well, it's like both. Like, yeah, reality in front of us, the physical world, is it on some level atoms and quarks and electrons and protons interacting with each other? Yes. But if you go through life only describing the world through the smallest descriptor, like the smallest individual components, uh, I think that's kind of a semantic error.
Well, I mean,
You
so
know,
it somewhat is. I mean, I'm somewhat. I'm not saying I'm being tongue in cheek, but I'm being a little more extreme, only because a lot of the things that we see coming out of things like Marxism, intersectionalism, postmodernism, are are uses of the collective to then pigeonhole people into their respective groups and have their hierarchies battle one another in an effort to gain the collective top. And so that sort of thinking of collective utility leads to interactions between individuals only on the basis of their collective, as opposed to the other way around, where you would say individuals are acting on an individual basis. If they all tend to act in the same way, that's a collective, I guess, but it's a different baseline.
Oh, I agree. It's a different, it's formed differently and it's got a different foundation. And I absolutely agree with that, and both in the sense of descriptively they're different and from an ethical, moral view, they're different. But I
Right.
don't think that it's really helping the conversation, or the movement to reduce liberty to reduce reality to just only individuals. Foundationally, it's always individuals first. Just like in science and in physical reality, it's always reducible to atoms. But this is where the Christian worldview, I think, is going to apply to, this might not be a very persuasive argument to people who aren't Christian, but
Hmm.
to you and I, you obviously view me as more than just a clump of atoms. You know what I mean? Like, you don't go, well, Jacob, you're wrong, because you're not even really Jacob. You are just a collection of cells, which are made up of tinier subdivisions, which are made up of
Hmm.
particular compounds, which are made up of individual atoms, which are made up of individual protons and neutrons and electrons, which are made up of quarks, which who knows if even that's, it's like, I don't even know what you are because, you know, I don't know what the smallest individual unit making up the collective of you is. I think this is a lot of kind of getting caught in the weeds of the level of analysis we use.
Yeah, I
And
would disagree that it's definitely getting caught in the weeds. Um, well, number one, I would say I would see you. So I would describe you as um, a child of God grafted onto the vine, and that's it. So there isn't really a need to go otherwise. But the other thing I would say is the reason why it's in the weeds is because the shaping of what's currently happened in a lot of the modern problems you might have with Western culture uh, is actually a result of collectivism and the ideas around that battling for these hierarchies based in their collective identity. So that's kind of where what I was going with that. Not so directly, unfortunately. It took a while to get there, but that's
sure, and
yeah.
I don't disagree with what you're saying there. That certainly is a large percentage of what the problems in our society are these collectivist forces at work. And
Mhm.
to me, it's not even just the postmodernist. It's even the Republicans tend to be rather collectivist too. And
Yeah,
it's
sure. And yeah,
so believe me, it's not that not I don't I'm not denying the dangers and drawbacks of collectivism in these contexts.
right.
But I don't think the solution to the problems of collectivism in these contexts is to say collectivism is always bad, or that collectivism is a like an illogical or invalid concept. I guess is just what I'm saying. To me, it's just like, uh, it's not an argument that to me holds water, because I don't find it persuasive or really functionally useful in the world, I guess, is what uh, what I would say.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the bigger, I guess, reason is to say, the problems you might have with what people might consider Western culture, I think, are rooted in that collectivism.
Oh, well, I suppose. Um,
It's definitely not
I
people
do
acting
think.
out of individual autonomy with others. Maybe they might act selfishly, but that's not necessarily the same thing.
Sure. And I don't view what's happening in society right now as a problem of radical individualism. And so to come up with examples of how individualism could be dangerous are going to be difficult because it's not immediately around us right now.
Mm,
But I think as a libertarian, you might maybe be able to see where I'm coming from, which is when you talk to some libertarians, it's like you get a glimpse into where individualism could even go astray. And it might seem like, well, how can individualism go astray? Um, and I think where it could go astray is if it's unhinged from, some kind of Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview of ethics. And
yeah.
you know what I mean? Because like if you get into this sort of
Mm,
mindset of, well, people are just these clumps of atoms, um, individualism can turn into a tyranny of this hedonistic, I only care about myself and my pleasure. Um, and without that Christian foundation of all people having inherent worth because of their status as being reflections
mm,
of the creator God. Uh, to me, it's not that I don't think that individualism is something that is you know without the risk for danger in certain contexts. It's just that in our society right now, that is not the current problem we're dealing with.
yeah. Well, I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head, at least as far as I'm concerned. And um, the lack of Christian or even I'll go as far to say acknowledgement of objective truth in God uh, has ruined the idea of the individual. And so many people, especially in the Christian world, have decided that this collective idea is the solution to such problems, when in reality, that's going to lead to much bigger issues. And if you ask me, and so ideally, I think, and I don't know if you agree, but you'd have the individual with their eyes and their objective morality based in God or a transcendent, and not science, who decides that what you feel is the only thing that's important today, and I'll just be a hedonist and act selfishly. You don't get your individual values to act in the world from this materialism. You get your values from the objective God, and so I guess what I'm arguing for is a utopianistic sort of thing where people would act um, as an individual under the authority of God, and not as an individual under materialism, and not as a collective under some authority of God, because then the collective no longer has personal responsibility. So that's kind of where, because it's easy for someone to be in a collective and say, well, we all agree with God, but we're not going to own up to our own shortcomings because you're in the different collective who's um, affecting us, whether you're on the alt right or the left. That's kind of what I'm getting at for all of this, is that individuals under the objective truth of God is better than, let's say, the collective. And so without Western
Okay,
culture,
yeah, I hear what you're saying, and there's nothing there that I disagree with in terms of is that like the foundation for the ideal what society. And yeah, I mean, I think you and I would agree that individualism coupled with a Christian worldview, the metaphysical presuppositions combined with the scriptures, yeah, I mean, that's, to me, that is kind of the that is the right combination to go after. um
right?
but I guess my point again is, now we're kind of keying in on how I don't think the problem is inherently collectivism versus individualism, where individualism is wholly good and collectivism is wholly bad. I think the real problem is, uh, not to turn this too preachy, but I think the problem is society that is godless versus society that is uh, filled with individuals uh, seeking after God, both individually but also coming together and doing it corporately. Because the Bible doesn't teach us just to be individual atomistic Christians acting alone, but to act as a body. And so, to me, it's like the problem is not any of these concepts by themselves. It's when it's just like anything. And this is again something where I doubt I'm going to get much resistance from you as a Christian, but the problem always comes back to people doing things outside of uh, or in opposition to the will of God, both His moral and authoritative will.
Mhm.
And to me, that's kind of where the problem comes from. It's like, you know, I don't want to focus so much on collectivism or individualism. I want to just focus on morality and uh, you know, uh,
Right, right. The problem, I think, I totally agree with you, and you're not getting resistance from me on that at all. But I would say the approach to such things is how that comes around, because uh, people tend to let's just take, well, we can take the full gospel approach, and then somebody would say, you're saved by grace, right? And the grace is never ending. But their association, that when they would resist such a thing, is still with the collective being this idea that I'm terrible along with these other people that have done such terrible things. There's no way that we would be at all taken care of, because God has better things to do, or God is dealing with the good people. And if you approach it by saying, no, you're an individual in the eyes of God, and He is personally with you as an individual, it's better. It's a better way of getting to people to understand this objective morality.
sure. And my only thing to say to that is that the way we go through life as Christian libertarians is complicated because we're kind of doing this dance where like as Christians, we do feel compelled to share the truth, the ultimate truth that you and I both agree in. At the same time, we don't want to only deal with people in these terms into the point where like they're going to stop listening to us because they're going to be like, hey guys, this is a libertarian group, not a come preach the gospel at us group. You know what I mean? And so we have to function kind of both as Christians, but also as like, okay, well, let's take our Christian caps off for a second for the purposes of talking about libertarianism. And not that we get rid of our Christian presuppositions, but just that we're not actively talking about them. And if I'm having a conversation with someone who's an atheist,
Mhm.
who is or isn't a libertarian, and I'm just talking about these concepts, um, if the conversation is not about Christianity, not that I might not bring up Christianity at some point in my set of conversations with that person, but like if we're operating solely as libertarians in certain conversations, uh, I'm going to be careful to not construe the world as individualism only good, collectivism only bad, because I don't think it's accurate, and B, uh, to the dangers of individualism being largely when it's uh, uh, you know not coupled with the Christian worldview. Maybe it's not a problem right now because it's kind of buried beneath the surface of all the different things going on in our culture and society right now.
Mhm.
But along with the problems of postmodern collectivism and identity politics, there's also a growing amount of postmodern nihilism and uh, this radical individual subjectivism that maybe that's not a huge problem right now, but
Mhm.
uh, it could be. And
Sure.
there's a little bit of a balance there, is
I
what I'm
see.
saying.
I mean, so yeah, so it's sort of like, would you rather have postmodern collectivism with these crazy discussions around, identity politics, or would you rather have a nihilistic tendency with for most people, which is can also lead to destruction. But my hope is, I guess, and my also I believe it to be true is the individual and the nihilistic point of view is not as pervasive if you look at history. That nihilism took over because number one, it's individualistic and it's difficult to band together. But number two, I believe that the transcendent and objectivity is self evident, and so the people that are steeped in nihilism only get there so far, and it's a small subset of people, I believe, because I don't think individuals can operate without identity, and so this is why I think the postmodernists in your identity politics type people have to have their identity. It's misguided into this world-based God that they've created through their hierarchies, whereas the nihilist, it's just not as pervasive because it's an intrinsic value of the human being to have an identity. So I just don't think.
True, and nihilism is also somewhat a self-defeating philosophy, because if you're a nihilist, you're not really motivated to go out and spread nihilism because you don't care.
Exactly.
But at the same time, I don't view nihilism as something that has come about because nihilists are going out there and spreading it. But the scientific world, secular world we live in that's rejecting God has been slowly discovering, that if when God's taken out of society and everything is material, you quickly discover, there's no value to anything.
Sure,
And
but
so a lot of people just get there on their own.
well, do they, or are people then just doing essentially replacement therapy by instituting what they would consider "quote unquote" science as their new ideology? And
Oh,
so
sure.
not
Yeah.
really, they've never actually become nihilists. I don't even know if it's possible truly. Because like you said, it's somewhat self-defeating, and number two, it's self-evident, and they've just glommed onto a new set of ideologies that they believe are objectively true. But as we know, science can't truly be settled, right? It's constantly evolved and through thought and experiment. So anyway, that gets way into the weeds on this discussion. But I think it's interesting.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I guess to bring it back, it's, I guess to go back to kind of tie it back to the central thesis of what we were kind of going after we've kind of hashed some of this out. I'm not against individualism. I definitely see the dangers of collectivism in our current society, and more individualism is certainly a enticing and would be an effective antidote to a lot of that collectivism. But I do think that if you completely throw collectivism out, you're kind of throwing. I do think it makes your worldview less comprehensible, I guess is where I'm going, because especially if you're operating as a Christian, because I think it's hard for a Christian to completely throw out the idea of collectivism. And I think the focus should be more, to me, my focus is less on individualism versus collectivism and more on, just liberty versus tyranny, which is all based on the idea of, coercion and voluntarism, which is the idea of, listen, have your groups and collectivize however you want, but don't do it at the point of a gun. Don't do it with the coercive power of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And because if you're doing these through democratic means, it's just majority rule, and it's just going to make people tribal and constantly in battle with one another, which is just not good. And B, you will, the other danger of the collectivism that that we're seeing is that it's highly weaponized by people with ulterior motives, people who don't really care about your collective, but will use your collective to their own ends.
Yeah, I agree with that. No, I don't think we can. I don't think we would disagree on the idea of tyranny at all, and coercing people through force or a gun or state sponsored guns. Tax collected gun money, which is pretty ironic actually, that you would then you would give them your money, or take, voluntarily engage in this society either way, and then they turn and take that money and point a gun at you. It's pretty terrible. I guess the only other thing I was going to say is, how do you find yourself rectifying, or I guess reconciling, libertarian individualism and Christianity, from like day to day, or your constant struggle? Is it something that you battle with, or is it just a not a big deal anymore?
Well, it's not a battle. It's more of there's a tension, and there's certainly a lot of exploration I do between that tension, trying to sort out where libertarianism and Christianity are compatible, and for the most part I find them pretty compatible, at least at the in the broadest senses. It depends on what flavor of libertarianism you're looking at, because there's it's nowadays libertarianism is almost like soda machines that not that we've been to restaurants in a while, but when the restaurants we used to go to had those soda machines where it was like you had infinite combinations, and that's libertarianism nowadays. But yeah, I mean, as far as like the individualism of libertarianism, I mean, I'm definitely not someone who says, like I said at the beginning, I mean, I agree individualism has to be the foundation, because, while I think collectivization has its uses and is not holistically bad, if you start out at the group and not at the individual, you are always going to end up at tyranny. Morality does not work in groups. Like it just you can't create a functional ethic system by looking at society as just groups, and that is the problem of a lot of these, the postmodern collectivism that's going on right now, and that's tearing our society apart. And
right,
and it's like I do see a lot of that as going back to the very beginning. That's why I don't really like to talk about Western culture, because I can't really make it easy to say that stuff's not part of Western culture, because it very much is so. I mean, postmodernism came out of France. It's very much part of, Western culture. And, if you want to say that we should preserve the parts of the Enlightenment that talk about individual liberty, I'm all for that. And, I just think it's helpful to be as specific as what we're talking about as possible.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I'm okay. I think that's a fair defense of that. And I think it's definitely something I wish more people would talk about, because it's I guess it's far too easy to decide, well, West is the best, and then also throw out all the other things that you're cherry picking. So it is nice to get a more wholesome view of what that actually means. Do you think that the United States, if let's say we define the West as the United States, would it be fair to say that's I guess the best culture, or would you say no? So the United States being, we'll say that's Western culture. So then we would say, from the beginning of the United States as an entity to now.
I like the Declaration of Independence. Like when I look at that, like the founding of America, I can't find much to even nitpick over in that. So if you're talking about just like the very core what America was founded on, which is, to me, the Declaration, there's not a whole lot there I can complain about unless I'm going to pull out my anarchist hat and get really
Mhm.
like triggered by, just like, don't, coming from that perspective. Um, but then the Constitution, when you jump to that, there's definitely a lot of problems with that. Now I know you talked about culture.
Right.
Um, there's not much with the beginning of American culture I have a huge problem with. I mean, it was a bunch of people who kind of started to, kind of look at they were living out the things that we're talking about in the writings of the Enlightenment philosophers. And the idea of like, why are we why are we a bunch of people who are more or less governing ourselves subject to the rule of this person halfway, the whole way across this ocean. And uh it definitely, the roots of it are things that are worth preserving and protecting. If you wanted to say that, that American patriotism and that part of American culture, the origins of it are worth preserving, I'd have very, you know, I mean, give me some time to reflect. I could come up with some nitpicks, but
Yeah.
I'd have to be. It would be getting into the weeds to criticize that. I'd have to push the bar to say, well, America as a whole, its entire history, there's a lot of flaws. But if you're just talking about the foundation of it, it was a very beautiful foundation, a very good idea, and it was an essential part in the development of human society as we continue to push the ideas of liberty. It's impossible to talk about that without looking at the
Right.
American Revolution, and that was definitely an important catalyst.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so hearing that, I agree, and I'll say the West is the best, and Trump 2020. You know.
Oh, I got sucked in.
Right. No, it's funny. It's what's interesting about that. Not until recently did I really start analyzing what we what we uh what we identify with the Constitution as a current in its current state, and then what flaws have come out of that. If we would have stopped at like the Articles of Confederation, uh, we might have had a much more libertarian America,
I
and I
agree.
don't think that we would have gotten to wealth as quickly as we did. Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to say. Um, but I think it would have been a more sustainable liberty focused country, because I think you would have had organic change among individuals as opposed to forced change through state guns.
Yeah, I mean, because basically, at least the parts of libertarianism that I find myself involved with, which is like, I'm somewhat involved with like the Mises Caucus, and the whole idea that the libertarianism that I push, because I'm kind of like, I'm somewhere between like Ancapistan and Minarchy. Like
Hmm.
I like Ancapistan. Um, I don't know if it's possible to make an Ancapistan world. Maybe you could do that on a small scale. I don't know. I'd like to think it's possible, but I also contend with the idea that you know you might have to have some things that are loosely called governments or something to that effect. But decentralization is to me the key, because if there's going to be governing structures, they need to be as local and voluntary as possible. And to me, the Articles of Confederation, they were immensely better than the Constitution, and that would have been a much better. Like I said, I like the Declaration. The Constitution, there's some good and there's a lot of granted it's 2020. I mean, it's hindsight's 2020, so of course we can, it's we we're looking back on it and going, oh, here's all the fatal flaws of it.
Hmm.
But yeah, the Articles of Confederation definitely would have been a better starting point, because it was much more focused on the sovereignty of the localities and the states. The federal government basically had no power, and of course the people at the top didn't like that, and so that's why they had to change it.
Right. It's the same old story, yet with a nice bit of uh, dressing on it. The same old tyranny that they were fighting. They recreated in a little better way. Um, and so, yeah, I actually tend to I idealistically I'm very much on the Ancapistan side of things. But if I'm forced to get into the political sphere and say, well, I'd like to associate with a party and associate with politics and the way that they're structured now. Lately, because of the culture war, I am very much identifying with the conservatives more than anywhere else, only because they have an actual movement outside of libertarianism. They have a movement that tends to fight this PC culture in postmodern culture. So the things that actually affect people every day, their cultural influence, I think, is useful.
It
Um,
depends on what conservatives you're talking about. I mean, if we're talking about guys like Tom Woods, Dave Smith, that lot, like, because I identify those guys as kind of like libertarian conservatives, and uh, more or less, that's fine. I do find much of the conservative movement to be unbearable because they're a bunch of border hawks and warmongers, and that's those things are kind of hard for me to
yeah, well,
brush
I
under
mean,
the rug, even though
right.
I'm no fan of the radical left that we have here in America today.
Hmm.
But so there's a temptation to want to support the conservative resistance to that.
Right.
But I fundamentally am motivated and convinced that you know supporting the lesser of two evils is always a bad move. I
Yeah,
just
I,
short term it might lead to less pain. I think long term it always is a disaster.
yeah. Well, there's always yes. I do agree that uh, there's long term pain. Um, but I think the libertarian movement on its own is already such a long term goal that I can make headway in some short term issues while still trying to make a long term goal. So I mean, there are just specific, single issue sort of things that the conservatives might agree with me upon, and so I'm having to then decide between horrible social issues and economic policy, and warmongering and other bad economic policy. And so all of that is pretty short term and much more impactful today and even in the next 10 years. So you take the short battles and you have a long term vision. And I don't see any way possible for the libertarians, which is a big reason why the Libertarian Party has really made me upset. Because there's no way you could get more liberty by kowtowing and taking any of the ideology of the left, most at least the way that they would implement it. But you could make headway with the ideology of the right.
Um, I see where you're coming from. I have some pushback. It's not like I'm certainly not a leftist. I At the same time, I think that conservatism has its pros, of course. I mean, ultimately, I do identify as a right-leaning conservative libertarian, and a
Mm-hmm.
Christian. But I'm just not happy, at least at this point in time. You've caught me, 2 months ago, I might have been singing your tune a lot more. Right now, I'm just not happy with the current status of conservatism and what a lot of conservatives, both in the Republican and the Libertarian uh, movements, have been handling things.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's should we resist some of the stuff on the left? Absolutely, but uh, there is such a thing as uh, letting your enemy turn you into the worst version of yourself as you attempt to do battle with them.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what I'm seeing. It's like, do I like a lot of the rhetoric, or like, do I agree on a fundamental level with some of the rhetoric from the left on social issues? Well, fundamentally, no. As a right-leaning conservative Christian, I tend to lean those ways on social issues when it comes to, in terms of, you know, morality, and in terms of how I live my life, what I teach my kids. And I don't want the government to push those social values on me. But when I see conservatives resisting that by being somewhat bigoted or hateful towards these groups on the left, I think that it's uh, a an error, an over response.
Hmm.
And ultimately, as a Christian, it's like, listen, I might not agree with the idea that some LGBT people push. Like, I don't agree with their views on, the human condition,
Hmm.
on how humans should live. But my job is to reflect Christ and to love them, not to um, uh, to come at them with hate and with vulgarity, which is something that I do think is a problem, and that I see. Uh, I'm starting to see a little bit too much of that, and um, and same thing with, like, not just with the LGBT, but like with the Black Lives Matter movement, and the identity politics there. It just seems to me like there's a lot of this. A lot of times, my problem is, it's like we're setting up a false dichotomy. It's like, well, I don't agree with how they're phrasing this thing, so I have to completely oppose it. Whereas to me, it's like there's a baby in the bathwater that you're throwing out, because uh, do I agree with the leftist narrative in terms of, like, the full leftist narrative of systemic racism and that
Hmm.
America is racist? As it's presented, no. But do I think that the institution of the state disproportionately hurts minorities? That the legal systems and the law enforcement don't disproportionately hurt minorities? That there's not a that maybe that the policies have changed on paper, but that there's still a history of things that did happen in the past, both from slavery to Jim Crow, redlining, all that, different policies that negatively impacted minorities, that have caused those communities to accrue less wealth. And listen, even policies like welfare and the democratically controlled cities, that, like, sure, like, we can blame the Democrats for a lot of that, how they've created these bad incentive structures that have led to some of the pervasive problems in these communities. But, like, a lot of that stuff is things where, sure, should we preach individual responsibility? And that, is it wrong to say your predicament is because America is predominantly white and the majority of whites are racist? Like, no, I don't agree with that. But I don't think that the response to that is just to completely ignore all systemic problems. Especially as a libertarian, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that there are systemic problems. And so it's like, the culture war that's going on really has me in a bind, because I feel like people are kind of like looking at me and saying, pick a side. And I'm just like, no, like, I'm not with them, but I don't agree with the strategy of opposition that conservatism is employing.
Hmm.
And I feel like, especially as a libertarian, I'm always very cautious of people who try to use the kind of reasoning of, well, we have to stop X group now because the consequences will be so disastrous. And I'm just like, to me, this just seems like, historically speaking, the same argument that's always been used for what ends up long term being an expansion of state power.
Yeah.
And listen, like, I'm engaged in the culture war as a Christian, in terms of, ultimately it's not like I'm trying to win. I'm trying to bring people to Christ. But uh, I refuse to, in any part, mix my politics with this culture war, because to use the state to win the culture war, to me, is just to like fundamentally, I am that's too much of a compromise on my values. It's like you're winning at the expense of becoming something else that is monstrous and despicable. Sorry to go on that long rant, but it's like this is something that's very much been on my mind, and it's a subject that I've thought long and hard about. It's not something that I take lightly. I try to not be. It's conservatives are often labeled as reactionaries, and
Mhm.
that's true to a point. I mean, I think it is true.
Yeah.
Like, we are reactionaries in terms of like, hey, don't casually dismantle things that have existed in society because there might be like, value to them, and we shouldn't just casually throw things out, and let's examine them. But there's also there's such a thing as being overreactionary to the point where you you come on way too strongly.
Yeah, well, it depends on whether. So if you choose not to engage at all, there's I guess, a different outcome to the situation for you. Maybe not. You may just be lumped in with the mess. And so if I think ideally, as Christians, we take an issue, evaluate it with prayer, biblical truth, and make a decision if we have to, and ultimately leave the decision to God. So that's how we should do it. And But unfortunately, that means most times, at least from what I'm seeing, that means you are automatically a pariah to the left. Automatic. I don't think there is anything that the current left in America will actually corroborate with a Christian's point of view. And on the right, they'll kind of pretend to support you, but there's a whole other set of baggage that comes along with that. And so you don't have to choose a party. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying when you engage in society to do something, for instance, if you're going to try and I don't know, meet at church, amid the COVID scenario, you're going to get resistance from both sides. That's a difficult place to be in. But I think more conservatives probably will allow you to engage in your activity than the left would. And so you end up in that sort of collective group, as it were. And so as much as I agree, I think if I'm going to engage, and the left has basically set the terms by way of the media at this point, I now have to respond amongst those terms. So there's only so much you can do in terms of remaining neutral when you're trying to engage with others.
Sure, I wouldn't classify, and if you disagree and you want to, maybe I'm wrong, and you could make an argument that would persuade me of that. But I don't really view what I'm doing as being neutral. I view it as, I do believe that action should be made, but what I'm not willing to do is to, I'm not willing to just do anything to achieve victory, I guess is what I'm saying. And that, like there's this whole, there's like, it's the old saying, like, in going, in going after a problem, don't become the thing that you're seeking to destroy.
Right.
And coming back to the Christian worldview, I think we as Christians in America are a little spoiled. the country that has the most, it's like I think the most number and probably also the highest percentage or the largest growth of Christians in the church is communist China, where persecution is the highest. And I think American Christians are a little spoiled into, kind of like we expect to live in a society in a world where it's easy to be a Christian. Well, nowhere, there's really nothing in the Bible that really says that A, that's likely to happen, and B, that you should go out and your goal should be, it wasn't like, hey, spread the gospel and make disciples and also affect political change to make it easy to be these things. It's like, no, like actually the first 500 years of the church was, rather uncomfortable to be a Christian. And not that I'm anti-Catholic, but, the church kind of, Constantine's conversion was sort of a chance to, hey, we don't have to be persecuted anymore, and now the church will be part of the state. Well, I'd argue the consequences of that weren't great in the long term. And, when you trade comfort, and, isn't this kind of a libertarian point? Like, if you trade comfort and security for principles and freedom, that's a compromise that you're always going to lose in the long run. And I guess I'm a bit more cautious to just, in this case, be just react in the fashion that a lot of conservatives are. It's definitely tough. I'm like, I don't like what the left is doing, but I don't want to, I'm ultimately a Christian, and I'm always evaluating my actions at the core level by, is this, what would Jesus do? Is this reflecting Christ? Is this how Christ would act in this manner? No, I'm not Christ. I'm not perfect. And I'm sure that, like every other Christian, I fail most of the time. But I just don't see a lot of Christ in what a lot of conservative Christians are doing, this point in time. I mean, there is an element of self-sacrifice, and, the Bible says that you're going to, for the most part, that you're going to be pariahs of the world in a way, because you're separate and distinct. And
yes,
I feel like we have had it pretty good here in the West, and Christians are afraid to let go of that. And I totally get it. Like, I'm not sitting here saying I want to be uncomfortable, but I'm not willing to preserve my comfort with means and methods that I find to be unacceptable. And that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think it's fair, and I would never disagree with that. And it's sort of a difficult thing that when the rubber meets the road, it's hard to make the decisions that seem to that affect you immediately. And so that's what typically happens.
Like just the other day in a Facebook group, I accidentally, I was defending Christian values and accidentally offended a transgender person. And I could have just said, oh, well, like, this is what's true and whatnot. But instead, I reached out to the person and had a conversation with them and said, like, listen, I might not agree with your worldview, but like, here's my heart. Here's where I'm coming from. I don't have hatred towards you, and I don't see enough conservative Christians doing that. It's like a lot of them are just like, they're reacting in these defensive ways that are just like, well, they're coming for us, so, we got to fight back and, punch back twice as hard. And I'm not saying that's you, but like, that's a lot of conservatives. And I guess it's like, if you're like a secular conservative, which I guess that kind of exists, maybe I can't fault them as much, but the Christian conservatives, especially, I'm like, we should know better than this, in my opinion. I don't think that's helpful. Don't become the thing that the left, like, I don't agree that most conservative Christians are hateful bigots, but don't let them troll us into becoming that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. It's too easy to do that, and I rail against libertarians pretty often as well. In the left, in the right-sided folks that are constantly looking at increasing oppression. So everyone, in my opinion, gets a fair shake at from me when it comes to my opinions on what they're actually doing. And so I think it's mostly case by case for most people, but it's when so often the case piles up, it's hard to not draw a line in the sand, and so um, I think that's fair. There was one other thing I was gonna go on real quick, and I was gonna say, with regards to the current state of things, and both you and I probably have our issues with the way the feds are currently deciding to wield their power in some of these municipalities and cities. I would, I would,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's safe to agree to say that you probably don't agree with that idea as well. Um,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
came
I
up
don't.
with a well, so I came up with a sort of solution to that, and I kind of wanted to bounce it off of you for a second. Um, if the cities decided, hey, we obviously don't have the police power to deal with this situation, um, and then the feds are saying, well, we have to do something. Um, there is a third option. It's not as nice, but you would tell the people that basically you would deputize a militia, uh, or the people that are such fans of the blue line and the Second Amendment, and you would say, well, we need help, guys. The police force is in trouble, and it's time to move up. So then the feds save face because they're not bringing in their jackbooted thugs, or what is the the mayor called them Trump troops, which is laughable. Um, in Chicago, but then you
Yeah.
weaponize the individuals to then become your militia force, or deputies, and then you just have a bigger police force when it's the individuals putting their money where their mouths are, and the feds are no longer culpable to their you know
So I mean, just to make sure I'm following along, this would essentially, like to steelman it with like a concise statement. Basically, your idea is it should not be defund the police and chaos, or defund the police and not the feds take over. It should
Mhm.
be privatize the police and put that kind of power back more into privately individually formed militias that are made up of people.
Well, be privatized with payment or not, and basically just put a call of action out to individuals that care about their rights in the state and care about their city or their freedoms in the state, and ask them to become what they claim to be.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's something I've thought about and said too. I think that the only risk with privatization is not really the fault of privatization. It's just more the fault of the state, which is if the private forces get hired by the state, well, then they're just you know now they're just state actors again. But other than that, yeah, I think
Well, I
privatization
mean,
and
what currently
decentralization is always the goal.
prevents uh, individuals from manning up, showing up, and helping out? It's the way that they enforce and create precedents for defense laws, and trying to quote unquote stop vigilantes, which, I mean, those sorts of discussions are ridiculous because I've yet to see a swath of Batmen in these cities that they have to have these laws to prevent such things. In my opinion, these laws are to oppress so
I
that
mean, some people might cite I'm terrible with some of these name pronunciations. What was it? Armud Aubrey, the really kind of botched
yeah.
citizens, the botched citizens arrest. So like,
Mhm.
and I had my thoughts on that too, which was like,
Mhm.
that's the only problem with some Second Amendment, uh, kind of conservative private militia dudes, and it's not that you know, it's a criticism coming from someone who is one of those people. I mean, uh, I mean, what I like to say, because this is going to be on the internet in public, is that I have a locker that used to be filled with guns behind me. The shame that I lost them in a boating accident last week, but tough luck on that. But yeah, I totally support. I'm a big Second Amendment, big gun rights person. And, I think that for the most part, over, I mean, listen, we can't create utopia, whether it's the state or it's private forces. There's a risk of people who are trying to protect the rights of others doing things that in isolated incidents are, they go too far and they cause harm that's not justified. But is, is that more likely in a state system that's essentially socialized uh, police, where you have things like qualified immunity, and, the law enforcement and the police are kind of in cahoots together. So it's not really like the law enforcement's very motivated. I mean, the judicial system is not exactly, going to be the most motivated to crack down on the overreaches of police. And, no one loses money when police do something bad. I mean, maybe like now some are in some cities, but just generally speaking, when state actors screw up, they get raises, not pay cuts. So, I mean,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I think overall, while there's always a risk of a person with a gun or a person coming in to protect someone or to protect their rights or someone else's rights, there's always a risk that something could go wrong. But people who know that their actions have consequences, both in a market sense and in a like, if I hurt someone without just cause, that's going to, like, I'm going to have a good defense in court, I'm going to end up in some serious legal trouble. That system is going to be inherently less riskier, I think more productive, and it's going to produce, probably in the long run, a more peaceful system of law enforcement than a socialized one. And the only thing that's preventing that, other than you know the state, which doesn't like competition, is just that socialism makes people lazy.
I think it's perfect ending.